Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and when I first played Mega Man 3, I really liked the Doc robots. I like old concepts getting revisited under new circumstances, and... hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. Just imagine my surprise when I found out that some hate these guys, going so far as to skip them with a code. So why not do another boss review, discuss what I like about them and what others don't, and maybe try to decide whether the Doc robots are great and some people just whine too much, or if they do kinda suck and are probably another symptom of the rush job that 3 was. No pun intended. Here's where I'd normally try to pop in a boss strategy, or at least a description of the fight, but we're dealing with 8 encounters, so all I can really say is that they toss in the Robot Masters from the last game and some brand new sprites, and you have to re-kill them again. And like I said in the intro, I like revisiting things under different circumstances, and the Robot Masters from 2 are really cool, so I'm happy to see them again. Here, you refight them with not only a different set of weapons, but also the slide, which is a game changer. And yeah, you have to figure out their weaknesses all over again, but each has like 2 of them, so you have a 25% chance of getting it right, just wildly guessing. Not too bad. I also think that the boss fights are one of the big highlights of every game, so them just throwing in another 8 seems like a great deal to me. At the same time though, there are a few issues here. One of the complaints I saw looking into this was the hitboxes, which are bigger for most of these guys compared to their original bodies. I'm kinda surprised that I didn't notice this myself, given how many times I'd complain when bosses and other entries back me into a corner and I don't seem to have the jump height to get over them. The one I saw get brought up the most as a problem in this department was Quickman, but as fast as he moves, I probably ain't dodging him even if I could jump over. Though that does bring up that a lot of these guys function just a little bit differently here than they did previously. Some of them feel pretty much the same, like Bubble Man and Woodman. Others feel a bit easier, like Metal Man, who lacks a conveyor belt, and Airman, since you now have the option to slide under some of his twisters. Then there's Flashman, who feels just a bit more aggressive, and Heatman, who throws out the pillars after every dash, rather than just locking him into moving back and forth. And none of your weapons seem to catch Crashman quite as easily as Air Shooter, so you actually have to try and hit him, rather than spray and pray. On the whole, I'd say that they're a bit harder. I also see some complain about the needing to figure out the weaknesses, which seems strange since that's always a thing, but I will say that it feels a little less intuitive this time. A lot of the weapon rosters can feel like they were designed as part of a set, with their own logic, and while you might be able to predict things based on equivalencies, like Bubble Man previously being weak to Metal Blade and now being weak to Shadow Blade, there's not too many others here that you could do that with. Spark Shot's the only elemental weapon, and there's no big explosives. No, instead you get bouncy lasers, spammy spikes, and a spin. Normally I can logic or at least BS some sort of reason for why who loses to what, but here, outside of Metal Man being weak to magnets and the Bubble Man thing, a lot of them feel just kinda random. Maybe that's why each has multiple options this time, to make it easier to hit upon a solution, but given that in their original game, Metal Blade has a 50-50 chance of working, maybe that 25% isn't quite the deal it first seems. Them not being so logical also makes them harder to remember. While I can always pull out the right weapon on pretty much everything else, I still sometimes need to check a guide to make sure I'm not mixing things up for these guys. In addition to that, it is just a bunch of bosses that you've already fought. At least probably. And hey, if you're doing a back-to-back marathon, this might actually be the 3rd time you went up against them today. I know not everybody likes the boss rush, and this isn't too far off from that. Not only that, but like I said, there are differences between them then and them now. Thinking you have an encounter down, only for them to change things up in a small but significant way, can be disorienting. Plus, if you're one of those people who consider Mega Man 2 perfect, any tweaks could be seen as blasphemy, and on top of all that, there really doesn't seem to be much reason for it. Why not just have the bosses from the last game return? Well, maybe there's a story reason for it, like Wily was still pretending to be innocent and it was easier to play off his robot's weapon data getting hacked than it was them showing up wholesale, or maybe there wasn't enough room on the cartridge and they could only fit in static sprites of each RM, along with a multi-purpose new one. While there was clearly meant to be a bigger story here, they couldn't implement it. So whether it was due to plot or constraints, who can say? All we really know for sure is that we get 8 new bosses, that are actually just the same boss 8 times, just with 8 different powers that we already previously dealt with. I've seen some call it lazy, others call it padding, and still more sound like they'd be fine with it if they would have at least gotten a new power out of it. Even more contentious though are the stages these guys are found in. These are remixes of levels already in the game: Shadow, Spark, Needle, and Gemini Man's. You could look at these as being the precursor to the whole Double Fortress thing that would become the norm going forward. You know, Cossack then Wily, Proto Man then Wily, Wily with a beard then Wily, with Doc robots lacking their own map, but being pretty similar. I think most people see this as a whatever sort of thing, and I mean, it's just more game that you already paid for, though I could see some unaware of the setup being kind of annoyed, you thinking you're at the end of the game, only for another 4 or so levels being thrown in, but that's not super relevant here. These are 4 levels, already completed, just changed up, which might have been to help save room on the cartridge again by reusing assets, but that doesn't change the fact that they're 4 areas you already cleared, only now they're much harder. In my opinion, they almost come across as a hard mode. Sparkman's now having spikes in the long fall section, wheel platforms you need to carefully traverse, and nastier enemy placement, and Shadow Man's stage having a section with drop platforms over a pit, with the projectors further complicating things, and a ton more spikes, including the ceiling that would only be a problem if you try to rush jet over everything. That actually brings up the even more troublesome Needle and Gemini Man, both of which start out the same, a previous level kicked up to 11, but then throwing in parts where you need either Rush Jet or Rush Marine to get through. If you burn through too much of the support power's energy, you pretty much need to SD and start the whole level over again. While Gemini's water section can be kind of stressful, it isn't as bad since you can just compensate for lack of Marine with Jet instead, but Needleman's is really sadistic. I've heard it pointed out how nasty it is that the first part of the level puts power-ups just out of reach, requiring Rush Jet, before you know how important conserving your energy is, but I don't think this is so bad, since before you start the Jet section, there's a large ammo refill that should top you off unless you really screwed around with the power beforehand. The part that bothers me is all the refills you get on the path ahead that don't respawn in between attempts. Your first instinct is going to be to snatch them all up, constantly staying at full, but if you don't make it to the boss room, doing that will screw your future self over. If you happen to save that one at the start, you teleport back in right on top of it before you can swap weapons, and while you might be able to finagle some enemy kills by the ledge to get power-ups that way, you cannot make it over the whole chasm, even with a full tank without some pit stops. Well, maybe you could with the jump trick to conserve ammo, but if you know enough to do that, then you probably also know enough not to slurp down all the refills between here and the other side. On top of these ways to land yourself in no-win situations, there's even a spot where you can soft-lock yourself. Let me turn your attention back to Sparkman's remix, where the first screen has a jump that you need the rush coil to reach. If you kill the enemy and flub your jumps enough times, you're trapped. No way to leave the level or get the energy you need to get up. Granted, you're gonna need to be pretty bad to land yourself in that situation, which would be very unlikely for anyone who's already made it this far, but the fact that it is a possibility is kind of horrifying and seems like an oversight. Just one little patch of spikes to the left would be enough to at least avoid a reset. Now, while I said this was like a hard mode, that doesn't quite work, since 2 stages require abilities you need to unlock, and the person I was talking to compared it to a ROM hack. And yeah, that does feel like a more appropriate way to look at it. These definitely feel like the sort of thing I've encountered in fan content. As much as I enjoy Mario Maker, there's probably a reason these sorts of things don't end up in the official games too often. Though the final challenge does exist. Cruel and unusual is the phrase. And I haven't even gotten to probably the worst part, that the Doc robots come to a stage, with questionable checkpoints. In a regular level, you'd get 2, one about halfway, the other in the boss hallway. Here, you'd probably expect there to be an extra one, since there's an extra hallway, but nope, the first comes after you beat the first Doc robot. That means if you die to Doc Woodman, you have to do Kaizo Shadow Man from the beginning. That probably also contributes to the frustration of needing to figure out weaknesses again. Typically, you'd be expected to die a few times to a boss. Get to the room with partial health and, assuming you're not on your last life, you maybe try to feel out a boss pattern and a strategy before going at them for real. Here though, failure has you redoing half a stage, so there's a lot more pressure to beat them in one. Even when it comes to the second Doc robot, with its standard checkpoint, this pressure is still present, since a game over isn't just a simple beat the level again for another shot, but a harder stage with another boss, and the need to really manage your resources in between. The Doc Robot stages have some of the harshest punishments of any of the classic games. And yeah, a lot of the stuff gets significantly easier the more you play. You learn tricks like the Rush Jet Jump exploit, and knowing that the game will choke you with more E-tanks than you can drink for the Wily stages can loosen your grip on them a bit here. But that first time through can be especially cruel. While I'm not sure if I'd call 3 the hardest of the NES Mega Man titles, these stages likely will make them feel that way, going into them blind. When it comes to the Doc Robots, their stages, distribution, and the bosses themselves feed into each other to make them exponentially harder than any would be on their own. It certainly feels like a hell for new players, so hearing that some only bother beating them once, then skip them every run after makes sense, but I could never bring myself to do it. As for whether they're bad game design, well, I'm gonna refrain from making a judgment here. While I'll defend the original Yellow Devil to my grave, the points for and against these guys make too much sense for me to push too hard either way, even if I did spend more time on the negatives. I really like the 2s, find refighting them again with new weapons and the slide fun, I think the design's cool, and just love Mega Man 3 too much to see more of the game as a bad thing, but at the same time, I may be biased. It is a pretty significant difficulty spike, and is mostly recycled content with some questionable tweaks that could be considered padding. I won't try to convince anyone on where I think they should land on the subject, but ideally you can enjoy them because who wants to not enjoy a game? Though whether you do or don't isn't exactly a choice. With that, I'll ask you, do you love, hate, or tolerate the Doc Robots, even going so far as to skip them? And are there any pros and cons I missed? That'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. Also gotta question if I'd be so lenient on the Doc Robots if they weren't just a one-off and maybe overstayed their welcome. I mean, for everlasting peace!